The third plenary meeting is called to order. Dear participants, this morning we will continue the thematic debate on the risks to humanity of a nuclear conflict and its devastating humanitarian consequences. As indicated yesterday, if the thematic debate concludes early, it is my intention to move directly to the general exchange of views and to conduct the meeting on a rolling basis. We now turn to the second panel discussions entitled The True Cost of Nuclear War, Understanding the Knowns and Unknowns and Countering the Fallacy of Limited Nuclear Conflicts. I am now pleased to give the floor to Ms. Melissa Parke, Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, who will moderate this panel. Madam Parke, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, esteemed panellists, distinguished delegates, it is an honour to welcome you all to this critical discussion about the true cost of nuclear war. And I extend my deep gratitude to our panellists, some of the leading experts, and yet from different perspectives, on the issues we are tasked with discussing. The subject before us is a most sober one, and yet to advance nuclear disarmament, it is necessary that we, and by we I mean all of us, states and civil society represented in this third meeting of states parties, that we take on some of the most pernicious misconceptions about what nuclear weapons do, how a nuclear war would unfold, and how the policies, practices and rhetoric of nuclear-armed states endangers every living being on this planet. This includes correcting some of the most dangerous myths about nuclear weapons, such as the notion that a nuclear conflict can be contained or limited. This fallacy disregards the overwhelming scientific evidence that demonstrates how any use of nuclear weapons, whether tactical or strategic, even a single use, would have devastating global repercussions. So our panel will talk about the true consequences of what will happen in a nuclear war, but also the consequences of what is already happening, how lives are harmed by the very possession of nuclear weapons, the expansion of nuclear arsenals, and the reliance on nuclear weapons and so-called nuclear deterrence in security policies by nuclear-armed states and nuclear complicit states. We hope that this discussion helps to empower different actors, both governmental and non-governmental, to take forward the work of nuclear disarmament and to further the universalisation and implementation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Following the presentation by panellists, we will open up to questions and answers from others in the room. In this regard, it is important to note that we have in this chamber some of the highest expertise about the true costs of nuclear weapons, what nuclear weapons are and do, and that is the survivors of nuclear weapons use, testing and manufacturing, the representatives of affected communities. So with that, I look forward to an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. I now turn to our panellists. Firstly, on my right here is Professor Nick Ritchie, University of York, Ms. Annie Jacobsen, author of Nuclear War, A Scenario, Dr. Edwick Madzimure, Humanitarian Disarmament Advocate and Founding Director of WILP's Zimbabwe section, and Zia Mian, co-chair of the TPNW Scientific Advisory Group and Program on Science and Global Security, Princeton University. They will each speak, then I will ask them some follow-up questions before we open the floor to Q&A. So firstly, Nick Ritchie is a Professor of International Security at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. His research and teaching focus on global nuclear politics and US and UK national security. He previously worked as a research fellow at the Department of Peace Studies, University of Bradford, and as a researcher on nuclear disarmament at the Oxford Research Group, a UK NGO. He's published widely on nuclear weapons policy, disarmament and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. His work has been funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Economic and Social Research Council and the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. So, Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam Chair, Excellencies and friends. When I last spoke to you from this podium at the second meeting of states parties, we were 78 years into this giant human experiment of placing a superweapon of potentially limitless destruction into the hands of fallible human beings. This is an experiment that can only ultimately be concluded through disarmament or through nuclear war. As we sit here today, we're in the 79th year of this experiment, and soon we'll be in the 80th year. So we live in an era of profound nuclear risk. And in its simplest form, risk is understood as a combination of the probability of an event and its consequences. And from the vast body of research that's been done, we've got a pretty good idea of the immediate and the wider global climatic effects of nuclear war, from extensive modelling using real-world data from nuclear tests, volcanic eruptions, wildfires, and so on. And so we've got a pretty high level of confidence that nuclear weapons create the possibility for nuclear war with consequences that scale all the way up to the termination of our technological human civilization that's evolved over the past 6,000 years or so. So this is an extreme consequence, which means that even if there is only a small probability of it happening, it is a very significant ongoing risk. And in fact, nuclear war is characterized as one of a handful of global catastrophic risks. Other risks like this are global pandemics, ecological catastrophe, a major asteroid impact, a supervolcano eruption, superintelligent AI, and so on. And some of these global catastrophic risks are natural events that might be beyond our control. Some of them are human-made, but they're systemic and diffuse and difficult for us to address. But nuclear war is human-made, and it's quite a centralized risk, and one that we can address, and that we can do so relatively straightforwardly through the elimination of nuclear weapons and through the ongoing control of fissile materials. So that's the big picture, if you like, when thinking about the risk of nuclear war and nuclear violence. But I'd like to highlight a few more specific things about this risk for you. The first of these is that the risk of nuclear violence is an essential feature, not a flaw, of the practice of nuclear deterrence. This is because if the threat of nuclear violence is going to have its intended coercive effect, then there needs to be some risk that nuclear weapons will actually be used. If there's zero risk, then there's zero chance of a state having that coercive effect that it's seeking through making nuclear threats. And we know that nuclear-armed states go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that an authorized command to fire nuclear weapons will be carried out with certainty when demanded. And Annie will unpack a lot of that process for you. The second issue to highlight is that supporters of nuclear deterrence acknowledge all this. They acknowledge that there's risk, right? But they tend to argue that the risk of nuclear violence in, say, a very serious crisis between nuclear-armed states, something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, they argue that those risks are knowable and that they are controllable. That the risk of nuclear war can be managed, that it can be manipulated through skillful statecraft in which one side or the other inevitably blinks first in what's been described as a competition in risk-taking. This competition can move the protagonists up the level of escalating violence, but the general consensus is that this is a competition in risk-taking in which the collapse of a crisis into nuclear war is always somehow held in check through a shared fear of nuclear war. And the third thing, just to bring to your attention, is that there's been a lot of statistical analysis of the claims made about nuclear deterrence and its certainties and effectiveness and so on. And these studies use databases of conflicts between states. They compare patterns of conflict involving combinations of nuclear-armed and non-nuclear-armed states. And they show that, yes, under some conditions, nuclear weapons can reduce the probability of war. There's evidence that they can constrain crisis behavior. But all of this body of work shows that there are no definitive conclusions from this. And studies show us that nuclear deterrence also requires the leaders of nuclear-armed states to get ever closer to the brink of disaster by escalating their conflicts in order to try and make their nuclear deterrent threats seem as credible as possible. So there's a lot of detailed research that's been done, and this does not support the conclusions of this body of work over many years. The conclusions do not support the type of unequivocal claims that are made about nuclear deterrence and that its supporters routinely make. So, we can accept that coercive nuclear threat might work as intended, when intended. But will they work across all cases, across all time, across all contexts? That is a very big bet to place when we know about the fallibility of people, the fallibility of organizations, the fallibility of systems. And we know that there are many complex risks that are not knowable and manageable. They are unknowable, unpredictable, and unmanageable. And the risk of nuclear violence in an escalating conflict should be understood in those terms. In terms of the probability of nuclear war, this is an impossible question for us to answer in a meaningfully accurate way. It's very difficult, and studies show us this, it's very difficult to measure even the lower bounds of nuclear risk with any degree of accuracy because we simply don't have the empirical data. And that is a mercy because we would only get empirical data through successive collapses of nuclear deterrence and fighting lots of nuclear wars. There's not enough evidence to make empirical estimates about the probability of an event like nuclear war. I just want to say something about three more specific areas then, which will pick up, I think, on some of the issues that my fellow panelists will speak to. Three areas where we can say something concrete about nuclear risks and trying to think through the probabilities and possibilities of nuclear violence. The first is that there is a substantial body of work that's looked at nuclear weapons decision-making processes and drawn on insights from psychology and social psychology on risk-taking, misperception, how extreme stress on policymakers affects their decision-making in crises. And this body of work shows us that this fear of nuclear catastrophe doesn't cause in the protagonists in a conflict a shared rationality. It doesn't cause them to think the same way, have a shared understandings about how to manage nuclear conflicts. It might do, but there's nothing at all that predetermines that it will. What we do know is threats, serious threats, including nuclear threats, can do quite different things. They can incentivize risk-taking. They can incentivize resistance to those that are making those threats. They can intensify crises, especially when threats are perceived as provocative and humiliating. And case study research shows us that political and military leaders have made and will continue to make serious mistakes in serious crises, including nuclear crises. And they make these mistakes based on misunderstandings, hubris, and overestimating how much knowledge and control they think they have. Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump are prime examples of this, I think. The second area just to highlight is research on organisational theory and complexity. Now, this body of research shows us that accidents and system failures occur quite routinely sometimes in tightly coupled, complex systems like a nuclear weapons complex. These sorts of accidents can cascade quickly through systems in ways that are impossible to predict in advance, very difficult to understand or control as they're happening. Examples of this type of accident are the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986, the Fukushima nuclear power plant meltdown disaster in 2011, and so on. But researchers also looked, in terms of nuclear crises, at the way in which, especially through the Cold War, but continuing, the way in which the US nuclear enterprise and the Soviet and now Russian nuclear enterprise are really tightly coupled together, and that together these two complexes exhibit all the characteristics of a single, tightly coupled, complex system. And because of this, both nuclear deterrence and what Kennedy called the final failure of nuclear war, both of those are quite plausible emergent properties of this complex system. Advocates of nuclear deterrence will deny that. They operate on the assumption that there's only one outcome of doing this, and that's nuclear deterrence, and routinely deny that system failure and system collapse to an unwanted massive nuclear war is just not something that we need to entertain. And related to this is a body of growing research that demonstrates the role of luck in preventing nuclear detonations through accidents and through crises and so on. Luck cannot be accommodated within rational theories of nuclear deterrence, and yet the evidence that we have is that luck plays a really important role. And so what do advocates of nuclear deterrence do with that information? They deny that luck has any role. And yet luck does, and it's been demonstrated empirically through some fantastic research by great colleagues of mine. So these are some of the issues that we need to consider when we're thinking about the risk of nuclear violence in a system of nuclear armed states as we continue into this 80th year of this giant human experiment. And I'll just sum up with 4 things then that I think we can say that we know. First, a nuclear war involving tens or more of nuclear detonations would be a catastrophe with cascading consequences that can scale all the way up to the collapse of human civilization. That's not hyperbole, that's what we have designed as humanity. The second is that the risk of nuclear war is greater than zero, and it's becoming more complex, and claims to be able to know and manage and control that risk are misplaced quite fundamentally. The third is that claims about the war prevention benefits of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence that are used to justify the taking of these risks by 9 states, these are empirically contested. They are contingent upon context and contingent in certain circumstances upon just pure blind luck and chance. And the final point is that we don't have, and we don't ever want to have, the empirical data to calculate a more robust, probabilistic risk of nuclear war. We know that the risk is there. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to put a number on it, but it's certainly greater than zero, and there's a strong sense at the moment that it's increasing. I'll leave my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that insight. And of course, in mentioning the role of luck in avoiding nuclear war, we've had the comments from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, that when it comes to nuclear weapons, luck is not a strategy. So now turning to our second panellist, Annie Jacobsen, over to you. Oh, sorry, let me introduce you first. Annie Jacobsen is a journalist and the author of the current international bestseller, Nuclear War, A Scenario. I urge you, if you have not yet read it, to do so. Ms. Jacobsen is also the Pulitzer Prize finalist in history for The Pentagon's Brain, and her other New York Times bestsellers include Area 51, Operation Paperclip, and Surprise, Kill, Vanish. She also writes for TV. A graduate of Princeton University, she lives in LA with her husband and 2 sons. Her books have been named Best of the Year and Most Anticipated by outlets including The Washington Post, USA Today, The Boston Globe, Apple and Amazon. Coverage has ranged from The Wall Street Journal to The Economist to Joe Rogan's podcast. Annie, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Thank you, delegates, everyone here. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. I am Annie Jacobsen, a journalist and author. I was going to have a slide presentation. We had some technical challenges, and the key moment was said to me, another reason tech cannot be trusted. And of course, AI and nuclear weapons have no place together. So with that said, I'm going to ask you all to use your imaginations. Hopefully that's all we ever do. So in reporting Nuclear War, A Scenario, I wanted to know, and I wanted you to know, what happens if deterrence fails. I put this question to 46 former presidential advisors, secretaries of defense, commander of STRATCOM, commander of the nuclear sub-forces for the United States, people like Richard Garwin, who advised every president since Eisenhower on nuclear weapons, and was the architect of the first hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb. When Teller couldn't make it explode, Richard Garwin did. He was 24 years old. I asked retired General Robert Keeler, the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, steward of all U.S. nuclear weapons and all U.S. nuclear weapons systems, what would happen in a full-scale nuclear exchange with Russia. And he said to me, Annie, the world could end in the next couple of hours. That is the true cost of nuclear weapons. So today, there are approximately 2,300 nuclear weapons on this planet. Between Russia and the United States alone, there are more than 3,000 nuclear weapons on ready-for-launch status. Some of them can launch in under a minute. And I'm going to quote Bruce Blair here, who said of the U.S. ICBMs, they don't call them Minutemen for nothing. There is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Every nuclear war game conducted by the Pentagon demonstrates this. In my book, I show a drawing, or rather a declassified document, an image of what a declassified page from a nuclear war game from the Pentagon looks like. It is entirely blacked out, redacted. There is one word you can read. It says scenario. Everything else is black. And my observation is that the Pentagon thinks it's unwise for people to know what will happen in a nuclear exchange. I disagree. And I was going to now take you through slides very quickly, 6 minutes quickly, because that is how much time the United States president has to make a decision once he is told by his presidential advisors, many of whom I interviewed, how much time he has to make a nuclear counterattack. So really reminding you here that nuclear war unfolds in seconds and minutes, not in hours and days. If North Korea were to launch a bolt out of the blue attack against Washington, D.C., it will take just 33 minutes for the nuclear weapon to travel on an ICBM from Pyongyang to Washington, D.C. An ICBM cannot be redirected or recalled. President Obama's top nuclear advisor, Andrew Weber, told me a bolt out of the blue attack against Washington is what Washington fears most. So what happens very quickly, and if we had slides, you would see them, you will use your imagination. The ICBM launches from Pyongyang. It takes less than 1 second for U.S. satellite systems in space to detect the launch of the nuclear weapon. U.S. space-based systems calculate that trajectory, and they learn in seconds the ICBM is headed toward the United States. In the next 1 to 3 minutes, senior military officials will characterize that threat from inside 3 nuclear bunkers underground. One, famously from all the movies, the Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado. Another, the National Military Command Center beneath the Pentagon. And the third is the Stratcom Battle Deck beneath Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. 250 seconds have passed. That's 4 minutes and 10 seconds. Confirmation. Now the Defense Department knows the ICBM is headed toward the continental United States. 250 seconds, guys. The Missile Defense Agency in the United States begins preparing its interceptor missiles will try and intercept the incoming nuclear-armed ICBM. The U.S. has 44 interceptor missiles. Russia has 1,670 nuclear weapons on ready-for-launch status. You can do the math. Each interceptor missile has a success rate of less than 50%. The Missile Defense Agency told me, yes, it is like shooting a bullet with a bullet. The trillion-dollar system, the SBX radars out at sea, they try to accurately track the incoming nuclear warhead. It has been 9 minutes. It fails. In Alaska, ground radars, U.S. ground radar systems, give that secondary confirmation that is required for the President of the United States to launch a nuclear counterattack. Secondary confirmation required. But the President must act. U.S. launch on warning protocol is exactly like it sounds. When warned of an incoming nuclear missile attack against the United States, the U.S. launches. It doesn't wait to absorb a nuclear blow. We have, in the United States, sole presidential authority. It's just like it sounds. The U.S. president alone gives the counterattack. He asks permission of no one, not the Secretary of Defense, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not the Congress. At 22 minutes now, this is the last sighting from radars in North Dakota. That incoming ICBM will strike Washington in 11 minutes. If a rogue nation were to launch a single strategic ballistic missile at the U.S., the response would be overwhelming force, some 80 to 82 nuclear weapons in response. Now it goes. The B-2 bombers take off. The nuclear-armed U.S. ICBMs launch. The nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered submarines launch their missiles. They call them the handmaidens of the apocalypse. UN Secretary General Guterres has told us humanity is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. And here's where that happens. The U.S.'s ICBM targeting systems, so the U.S. ICBMs targeting North Korea, don't have enough range to get to North Korea without overflying Russia, a fact confirmed with me by former U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. Russia thinks it's being attacked. Russia's command and control system mirrors that of the United States. Theirs is the equivalent of the bunkers that we have, they have. The radars that we have, they have, albeit less technical. And so Russia, thinking it's being attacked, launches. Russian doctrine, like U.S. doctrine, is to launch the mother lode of weapons. And there are more than 1,000 targets in the United States. All of Europe, NATO bases in particular, are targeted too. And when the U.S. learns Russian nuclear missiles are on their way, the U.S. launches the mother lode, a fact also confirmed with me by 2 former U.S. Secretaries of Defense. This is doctrine. That is the full-scale nuclear exchange. When nuclear winter theory was first written and presented to the world in 1983, the Defense Department called it Soviet propaganda. But behind the veil, the Pentagon knew it was true. The soot from thousands of fires burning will block out the sun's warming rays. Agriculture will fail. People will freeze and starve. State-of-the-art climate modeling today shows us that nuclear winter will be far worse than originally conceived. 5 billion people will die. The mid-latitudes, the breadbasket of the world, freeze over. Agriculture fails. In this depraved, radiation-poisoned world, the humans that remain will likely return to a hunter-gatherer state. And in my book, I have a photograph of a Neolithic site from 12,000 years ago, when humans were still hunter-gatherers, when we hunted and fought with spears. In the dawn of the nuclear age, Albert Einstein was asked what he thought about nuclear war, to which he is said to have responded, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Before archaeologists discovered Göbekli Tepe, that's the name of that Neolithic site I have a photograph of in my book, and this was in the 1990s when it was discovered. Before that, for 12,000 years, no one knew that civilization was there. And so how did they find it? I asked the archaeologists who found it. And they told me that when they went there in southern Turkey, a local rumor persisted. Locals told the archaeologists the story of the wishing tree. It's a power of great mystery, a place of power and great mystery, they said, a place where people went to make wishes for the future. And in the book, I also show you a photograph of this wishing tree, because there it was on the horizon. That is how they found Göbekli Tepe. That is how they knew where to dig. It was hidden. And so I end my remarks with this thought. Wishing is foundational to living. Many of us in this room wish all nuclear weapons would go away. Wishing leads to discovery, and it leads to action. There is more work to do. Thank you all for listening to me. It's an honor and a privilege to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie, for that vivid depiction of how quickly a nuclear war could start and how quickly it would escalate, which is also backed up by the outcomes of so many war games and nuclear exercises that it seems impossible that any military or government in a nuclear-armed state could be under any illusion about the fallacy of a limited nuclear war. Our third panellist is Dr. Edwick Madzimure, and she is a 34-year-old humanitarian disarmament advocate and researcher. Since 2018, she's been actively involved in disarmament advocacy, particularly focusing on the intersection of gender, nuclear weapons, climate change and militarism. Edwick is a member of key organisations including the international, ICAN, Vertic and BASIC, and she is the founding director of WILF Zimbabwe. She also serves as the African Regional Representative for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Edwick has contributed significantly to research and advocacy on disarmament at national, regional and international platforms. She will be receiving the prestigious Nuclear Free Future Award this evening in New York in recognition of her contribution to nuclear disarmament. Over to you, Edwick.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Congratulations, Mr. President, for your election. And thank you also for inviting me to share my insights on the topic, the true cost of nuclear war, understanding the knowns, unknowns, and countering the fallacy of a limited nuclear conflict. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, personally, I am pleased that the topic is referring to a limited nuclear conflict as a fallacy, because that's exactly what it is, a fallacy. We have countries today that are in support of the possession of nuclear weapons, arguing that they are mainly for deterrence. But it is the possession of these nuclear weapons and the dangers they pose that is keeping everyone on the edge, both the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. Nuclear deterrence is contributing to a lot of power imbalances at regional level and also global insecurity, because most nuclear weapon states are using their possession of nuclear weapons as a strategic advantage to detect global power dynamics. Wars that have happened over the years are also evidence to us that nuclear deterrence is not guaranteed, that being in possession of nuclear weapons can safeguard a country from acts of aggression. There are nuclear weapon states today that were attacked, despite them having nuclear arsenal. Far from a limited nuclear conflict, it is crucial to highlight that the modernization of nuclear arsenals taking place with the technological advancement within the field, such as the use of artificial intelligence, can expose all of us to the dangers of an unintentional nuclear detonation, which can be caused by program malfunctions. Thus, a possibility that we should not all ignore. Also important to mention that the high cost of developing and maintaining nuclear arsenals during a time when everyone is facing the devastating effects of a nuclear crisis is totally unacceptable. A research on military expenditure found out that only 3% of the funds that are being used by one country to develop and to maintain nuclear weapons can be enough to solve global hunger. I think it is high time that we develop or we invest in peace and not in war. The development and possession of nuclear weapons is also contributing to security dilemmas, particularly for countries that have chosen not to have nuclear arsenals. This is a major pushback that we are facing, especially to ensure that there is a total ban of nuclear weapons, because few countries that are holding on to their nuclear weapons, they are making it very difficult for most countries to be at ease. The possession of nuclear weapons by these few countries is also posing geopolitical tensions, and the mere existence of nuclear weapons is also creating a complex web of risks and insecurities, because some non-nuclear states may perceive their possession of nuclear weapons of others as a direct threat, and this is leading to global insecurity, and as a result, there is an increase in arms race. Military alliances are being formed at a time when the majority of the world's population today are calling for peace. While we are all aware of the doom that can be caused by a detonation of nuclear arsenals, it is very important to take note that environmental effects of uranium mining and the disposal of radioactive waste in local communities is also contributing to localized conflicts, and it's also affecting the health and the well-being of the host local communities. Since yesterday, we have all been listening to the testimonies from the survivors of nuclear detonations and nuclear arsenal testings. There is evidence to show that no one is safe. A nuclear war today would have devastating effects on the environment. And today, to emphasize that because of globalization and the over-reliance that we now have on each other through trade, no one is safe. I'm sure COVID-19 was a testimony to that. Nuclear detonations would release radioactive particles into the atmosphere, contaminating the air, water, and soil far beyond borders, affecting the neighboring countries and the neighboring and the regions. The soot and smoke from nuclear explosion, that's just like what Anne has been reiterating earlier on, would also significantly contribute to global weather patterns, a shift in the global weather patterns, potentially leading to a nuclear war, and with the drastic drops in temperatures that would also contribute to crop failures and widespread food insecurity. Thus, a nuclear conflict cannot be limited because it will cripple the global economies, particularly in sectors like agriculture, in health, and manufacturing. So non-nuclear countries relying on international trade for resources could also see their supply chains being disrupted and leading to widespread economic recession. So there is no limited nuclear conflict. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I want to challenge all the member states here to make sure that they push towards the strides on reducing, or not only on reducing, but ensuring that there is a total ban on nuclear weapons before they destroy the planet that we all call home. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, I thank you.
Thanks so much, Edwick, for highlighting the environmental consequences and security risks for non-nuclear states and how nuclear weapons are used as instruments of power. Turning to our final panellist, Mian is a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security, where he has worked since 1997. Zia is co-chair of the Scientific Advisory Group of the TPNW. He's also co-chair of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, a 16-country independent group of experts working to end production and eliminate stockpiles of plutonium and highly enriched uranium, the key ingredients for nuclear weapons. He's a co-founder and member of the steering committee of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction, and he serves on the board of the Union of Concerned Scientists. He previously served on the UN Secretary-General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Zia received the American Physical Society's 2019 Leo Szilard Award and the 2014 Linus Pauling Legacy Award for contributing to the global effort for nuclear disarmament. Over to you, Zia.
Thank you. After all that's been said and the fact that you're all here, there's actually not much that I can add that would take the debate forward. So I think that I will try and focus a little bit on what we don't know, because the previous speakers have emphasized what we do know and what we think we understand about the path to nuclear war, as Nick Ritchie mentioned, and then how it unfolds and the terrible consequences. So the first thing I want to say is that this is not a new knowledge. I mean, Nick mentioned that, this is now, we're getting to 80 years of the nuclear weapons age. But the fact that atomic weapons would have absolutely catastrophic consequences That knowledge is now more than 120 years old. And you might ask, well, how is that possible? And the answer is, scientists first came up with the idea of atomic weapons at the beginning of the 20th century, 40 years before the first weapon was ever made, tested, and used. In 1903, there was a paper written and a lecture given about the new science of radioactivity and the fact that atomic energy was possible. And one of the first scientists working in Britain argued that once we learn how to control this new atomic energy, whoever possesses it will have a weapon by which they could destroy the Earth. Okay? So it's not a weapon by which they could destroy a city or destroy a country. They automatically leapt to the fact that this new weapon would be so terrible it would destroy the world. And that sensibility was part of the shared understanding of the scientific community from that point onwards. And so 30 years later, when physicists actually learned how to control this atomic energy, the idea of the nuclear chain reaction that drives both nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons, the people that came up with that first idea, and it was the physicist Leo Szilard, in whose name this award from the American Physical Society is given, that Melissa mentioned, he came up with the idea of the nuclear chain reaction. And he said, I have no doubt in my mind that this will allow the construction of atomic weapons and that the world is headed for grief. And he actually tried to get all the other nuclear scientists of the world together to stop doing research in this area of physics altogether. He says, don't do this work, don't publish this work. Because once this work is out in the world, it will be turned into weapons and there will be no stopping it. But in that sense, it didn't matter that the scientists understood and gave warnings. Because what mattered was who knew and how that knowledge mattered to them. So if we think about how atomic weapons actually then came into the world, we automatically jump to World War II and the American Manhattan Project. And many people will have seen the film Oppenheimer. But during World War II, there was one brief moment in 1945, which all of you should know about. And this is before the bomb is finished. It is before the bomb is tested, and it is before the bomb is used to destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's in April 1945. The President of the United States, the new President of the United States, Harry Truman, is told by his Secretary of War, what they now call the Secretary of Defense, that there has been a secret program to make atomic bombs. He had previously been the Vice President, and he had not been told about this bomb program because it was so secret. So he is given a briefing in April of 1945 that the bomb is almost finished. And you can read the memo that is given to the president and the notes in the diaries of the people giving the briefing that we told the president this will be the most terrible weapon in the history of the world. And they said, quote, modern civilization will be at the mercy of this weapon and might be destroyed. So it's not just that the scientists knew what atomic weapons would do. The President of the United States, months before Hiroshima, is told that this is what this weapon could do. And there is no effort to stop the bomb program. There is no effort to not test it. There is no effort to not use it. And one thing that we haven't talked about is that we talk about Hiroshima as the first use of nuclear weapons in war. It's also the occasion of the first ever threat to use a nuclear weapon. The threat is made after the bombing of Hiroshima by the President of the United States to Japan, that if you do not surrender, there will be a reign of ruin, the like of which the world has never seen. Japan does not surrender. Nagasaki is destroyed and the second nuclear threat is made. So when we talk about the anniversary of the first nuclear test and the first use of nuclear weapons in war and Hiroshima and the second use of nuclear weapons at Nagasaki, we should also think about this is also the anniversary of the very first threat to use nuclear weapons and the second threat to use nuclear weapons. They all happen at the same time. So it's not that they didn't know how terrible all of this is. They've always known how terrible all of this is. And by the time we get to thermonuclear weapons, the hydrogen bombs that Richard Garwin helped invent, that Annie talked about, which are thousands of times more destructive than the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scientists who built those bombs knew that these weapons were so terrible that they actually said in a secret report that the knowledge of this weapon is evil. And yet the bomb programs went forward even though everybody understood what was going on. And once we had thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, and intercontinental ballistic missiles that could carry these weapons to the other side of the world in 30 minutes, then we are tied into this doomsday machine that people have been talking about. That the end of the world can come within hours at most. But we've known about this since the late 1950s. This is not new knowledge. So one of the things that is remarkable about the United States is that lots of old secret government documents are eventually declassified. And so there is one memo from 1958 to the President of the United States explaining a nuclear war game that has just been done by the United States using its new nuclear weapons, thinking about what war with the Soviet Union would be like. And it's written by the President's National Security Advisor, who's a general. And you can read this memo now. He says, in this war with the Soviet Union and its global thermonuclear war, that when we talk now of nuclear war, we think of the United States and Russia, or the United States and China and so on, or other adversaries. But in those days, they were talking about nuclear weapons going off, and I quote, North America, Europe, Asia, and North Africa within half a day. They were going to blow up almost everything everywhere in half a day. And so the National Security Advisor tells the President, the effect of this war is incalculable. No one knows what this will do when all of these weapons go off to the weather, to crops, to human reproduction. In other words, to the fate of the human species, to the population of all areas of the world. It is possible, and this is a direct quote, it is possible that life on the planet might be extinguished. 1958, what happens? The United States builds more nuclear weapons. And the Soviet Union has the same understanding of nuclear war. You can read speeches by Khrushchev from the early 1960s talking about how many hundreds of millions of people would die in a nuclear war, and that it would be catastrophic beyond measure, and that the living would envy the dead, as he put it. So what's new in all this knowledge about how terrible nuclear war is? And what do we gain by thinking about producing more knowledge about nuclear war? And the answer, I think, in part, is that a lot of this knowledge is secret and was secret at the time. Most people, including in nuclear-armed states, do not understand how their government intends to, in their words, defend them by conducting nuclear war. They just think that somehow this is a defense. So part of the production of knowledge is knowledge for whom, and in a way that it makes sense to them. Because fundamentally what we're dealing with are two ways of thinking about the world. One is a way of thinking about the world in terms of nationalism, and one is a way of thinking about the world as a common human community facing a common peril. And ultimately, I think that one of the things that we have to grapple with in the work that we do here is how to cross this barrier between thinking of these issues in terms of nationalism and nation states and in terms of a global human community. And let me just illustrate very vividly in today's language what I mean. So a little while ago, the president of Russia, President Putin, gave an interview to television about nuclear war, in which he was asked that, suppose Russia is attacked. And he said, then I would have a legal right to respond with nuclear weapons. And the interviewer asked him, but wouldn't that be a terrible consequence? And Putin says, this would be a global catastrophe for humanity. But I, as a citizen of Russia and the head of the Russian state, have to ask, what do we need a world for if there is no Russia? This is nationalism, right? This is ultimately what it is that we have to confront, that the interests of my state, my people, no matter how misguided, is more important than the future well-being of human beings everywhere. And so when we think about these issues of knowledge and limited nuclear war and running risks and so on, and the idea of responsibility and accountability, I think we have to ask the question, the scientists are of course responsible and should be held accountable for the work that they do in making and maintaining these terrible weapons. Because without the scientists, these weapons would not exist and would not be possible. But similar processes of accountability need to be directed at decision makers and policy makers in terms of how they put the needs and interests of their states before the interests of humanity as a whole. So I would end by making this final observation, that one lesson, and it comes back to what Nick Ritchie said at the beginning, one lesson that we can take from the nuclear age and now from the age of climate change, and we'll have this with the age of artificial intelligence and the new biology, is that human beings in our societies have found ways to make things that we cannot understand and imagine their consequences and how to control them. We have made monsters that are beyond our power to imagine how to deal with. And it is this that ultimately is the challenge of how to grapple with this question about what do we do about nationalism and the nation state, science and technology, and how to figure out ways of building structures of accountability and responsibility that will break past this notion of my people right and wrong, my state right or wrong, my state first. And I'll end with this one quote from Albert Einstein from 1955. Einstein was a socialist and a pacifist. And in 1955, together with the philosopher Bertrand Russell, they issued the Einstein-Russell Manifesto, calling for the end of nuclear weapons. And they said, remember your humanity and forget the rest. I think this is where the conversation about knowledge, nuclear weapons, and nuclear war has to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Zia, for that thought-provoking presentation, emphasising the importance of stressing collective human security rather than the narrow national security prerogative of a select few states. And of course, this year is the 70th anniversary of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. We'll now turn to the Q&A section of this second thematic panel. And I'll first ask a question of each of the panellists. And of course, if any of the other panellists want to jump in with further comments, please do so. And then we'll come to questions from the audience. So starting with Nick Ritchie, you noted in your presentation that there's not enough evidence to reliably estimate the probability of a nuclear war, but we know that it's greater than zero. But some of the research that you've compiled for the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs you include research from the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, where researchers estimate that the probability of a nuclear war in times of high tension is around 1% a year, and in low tension it would be 0.1% a year. But that probability rises over time. And when 1% doesn't sound like much, but I guess we can ask ourselves, would we get on a plane if we knew it had a 1 in 100 chance of crashing? Would we buy a lottery ticket if you had a 1 in 100 chance of winning? You'd think that was pretty good odds, actually. And the point is that the research shows that this 1% annual probability of nuclear war is a significantly higher risk than the design requirement for the failure of a nuclear reactor, which is less than 0.0001%. And the conclusion from that is that we're prepared to accept a much greater risk of nuclear war than we are for a major nuclear reactor accident. And if the risk of a major nuclear reactor accident is normally less than 0.0001%, and yet we have seen what happened with Chernobyl and Fukushima, how much more likely is a major nuclear war? And so my first questions for you, Nick, is how much do we know and can we know about the risk of war, a nuclear war, and how can we engage with nuclear deterrence supporters on the risk issue?
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, there have been a couple of studies, the two that you mentioned and one or two others, that have attempted to look at past precedent in terms of events that have happened in global nuclear politics and crises, and try to put numbers on this, accepting that there are very wide error margins. There was a study by the US economist Carl Lundgren in 2013, and he calculated that over the 66 years from 1945 to when he did the study in 2011, there was a 61% chance of a nuclear war. So that was 2.1% chance per year, or average frequency of one nuclear war every 47 years. Again, this is, and he talks through the difficulties of assigning these sorts of probabilities, but nevertheless, working with the evidence that we have, that's what that study concluded. And another study by Marty Hellman that you referred to there, who's a US cryptologist, mathematician, professor emeritus in electrical engineering at Stanford. So he calculated, trying to do this difficult task of putting some probabilities on this, he calculated an upper annual probability of a Cuban missile type crisis that would result in a nuclear war. The high end about 1% a year, lower end about 0.01%, which, as you said, even that lower end of 0.01% a year is massively, orders of magnitude higher than the risk that that states building nuclear power reactors are required to. I mean, that's the maximum risk that the figure you cited there. The design requirement for a failure rate leading to significant release of radiation from a nuclear power reactor, as you say, 0.0001%. So they're even if we only accept that these probabilities derived from serious study working with the very limited evidence that we've got, even if we think that they are kind of there or thereabouts, even if they're 2 orders of magnitude out, it's still a much higher risk than we are prepared to accept in terms of our safety regimes with nuclear power. You mentioned getting on a, if that was the risk of getting on a plane, well, we wouldn't get on planes. I mean, the risk nowadays of dying in a plane crash is about 1 in 13 million, which is, again, orders of magnitude below that risk for nuclear power disaster, which is orders of magnitudes below what we seem to be accepting and living with in terms of continuing to live in a nuclear-armed world with adversarial states who have standing weapons and plans that they exercise to perpetrate massive nuclear war against one another. But as I think Zia asked the important question, what do we do with this knowledge? It is important that we share that knowledge, but then it's a question of how do we collectively act upon it? What do we do with that knowledge? And the accountability function is a really important part of that, but also the mobilization and the inventing of new institutions and practices and rules and regulations, and to invent the process of nuclear disarmament is what we are doing here and what we need to continue to do.
So, Melissa,
Thank
can
you.
I comment
Yes.
on that?
Yeah.
Thank you. When we talk about this probability of nuclear war, etc., and comparing it to other probabilities in the way the question was asked, one of the things that's worth keeping in mind is that presented with the same information, different people will come up with a different judgment of the risk of what is happening. And let me illustrate this with one very clear, accurate example that we actually have from our space when we think about nuclear weapons. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a special committee that was created in the White House to manage the American policy decision-making for President Kennedy. And Daniel Ellsberg, who was working in the White House at that time, has written in great detail about how that unfolded. And so there is one passage in his book that talks about this question of risk and probability. And so Ellsberg is sitting on a couch outside the Oval Office, and he talks to one of his boss who comes out from this meeting of this executive committee, Paul Nitze, who was one of the leading American nuclear strategists and policymakers. And they started talking about, well, what's the feeling inside the room about the risk of nuclear war? And so Nitze told Ellsberg that inside this executive committee advising President Kennedy, they thought that the chance of nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis was about 1 in 100. But Nitze said that my own view is that it's about 1 in 1,000. And later, the same people said, well, it actually might be 1 in 10. And then President Kennedy said that he thought the chance of nuclear war was 1 in 3. So they all had exactly the same information about what's the Soviet Union doing, what's in Cuba. They were getting the same briefings, and yet it goes from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 3. So what does it mean to assign a probability to a risk when given the same information, people come out with such fundamentally different assessments of what happens next? And I'll end this story just with this more recent observation. There was a nuclear war game during President Obama's term in office. And it wasn't with the cabinet level officials, it was one level below the cabinet level officials. And so they were asked, so that what should we do if the Russians use a nuclear weapon? And so they had a debate and thought through all the options. And eventually they decided that the United States did not need to respond with a nuclear weapon of its own. They would respond with conventional weapons and international pressure. They did exactly the same war game with cabinet-level officials in the Obama White House. So the secretaries of all the major agencies. Same scenario, same information, different people. And the answer, the cabinet official said, oh no, we have to use a nuclear weapon, because it would look politically bad for the United States. So it wasn't about the military implications, it wasn't about strategy, it was about politics, that it would make the United States look bad. So it matters who is in the room. So the same situation can have different outcomes depending on who's in the room. And so this being able to assign probabilities to what happens and where, people matter in ways that we don't understand. But people absolutely matter.
I'll hand over to Annie now to respond.
I have a thought on that off of what Zia said, and of course I'm not in the business of probability in science, but what I do is interview people who run war games. And when I was working on this book, it was like deeply held secret how often the Pentagon runs these war games, how long, the details. I mean, that's just jealously guarded information. And after the book published, an admiral who I quote in the book, who at one point was the commander of all U.S. nuclear subforces, asked to see me, which is a little intimidating. Of course I went. And he said, "You never asked me how often we practice," which was pretty shocking to me. He obviously wanted me to know. And so there are nuclear war games that are these long, weeks-long, multi-organization war games. But what the admiral said to me was, when I was he was in charge of the military bunker beneath the Pentagon, the nuclear military bunker, and he said, "So guess how often we practice?" And I made a few guesses, and all of them were wrong, and I'll go right to it. And he said, "Annie, 3 times a day. There are 3 shifts at the Pentagon bunker." So the probability, how often you rehearse something, everyone can think of that in their own lives in terms of preparation.
Thanks, Annie. I'll go now to a question to you. What struck me about your book, Nuclear War, A Scenario, is that there's really no plan for the failure of deterrence. Officials seem shocked that this could happen. You've got a missile defence system that comprises 44 missiles in total with a 40% failure rate. The Federal Emergency Management Authority's primary role is to assist top officials in a nuclear war, while citizens need to self-survive. So there's no one coming to help anyone who survives a nuclear detonation, as the International Committee of the Red Cross has been warning for decades, because the road, transport, communications, hospital infrastructure is destroyed, health workers are dead or incapacitated, and there are lethal levels of radiation, which means no one's coming in from outside. Last year I attended a Nuke Expo in Oslo, and when one of the responders on the panel was asked what she would recommend that people do to prepare for nuclear war, she advised everyone to stock up on burns, cream and bandages, and to learn first aid. And so while I think learning first aid is a great thing for everybody to do in life, I actually think the better response might have been, well, let's prevent it happening in the first place by eliminating nuclear weapons through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But can you comment on what is really a dogmatic belief by some governments and officials that deterrence cannot fail, but that when it inevitably does fail, it is ordinary citizens who will suffer the most and be completely on their own? And there were also the comments by John Rubel about the mindless groupthink that can enable war plans to proceed for the killing of 1/5 of the planet's population with hardly any objection. And that meeting was in 1960, when plans to erase 600 million people were discussed, and that figure did not include the millions of Americans who would be killed in the counterattack, nor those who would die from fallout over the next 6 months, or the countless more who would die from starvation in a nuclear winter. And all of those numbers would be much higher today. So how do you explain this mindless groupthink that can so easily accept the erasure of millions or billions of people? And do you have any ideas on how that can be overcome?
So I'll start with the thought of Rubel. John Rubel wrote this very interesting memoir when he was about to die, about his reflections on being in the nuclear war planning bunker in the 60s, a plan that would kill, 1/5 of the planet, 1/3 of the planet, depending on the statistics. And he felt very badly later in life, and he spoke of this, that he was ashamed that he didn't speak up. And it's a really powerful, but that carries through that idea of mindless groupthink. And, we must keep in mind that when nuclear war plans were originally put into play in the 1950s, the idea was to fight and win nuclear war. And so the idea of deterrence only came along as it became obvious that you could not fight and win a nuclear war. And so, shift in policy, same weapons. But Stratcom has pinned, U.S. Strategic Command has, for a long time pinned on its Twitter feed, deterrence will hold. These kind of 3 powerful words. That's been taken down, by the way. And, I found a discussion between the Lieutenant General Bossier, who's the deputy director of Stratcom, saying, well, yes, deterrence will hold, but if it doesn't, it all unravels. And I think that unraveling is what is terrifying. And the final thought on this is about FEMA, this perception, this complete fantasy that we can all, take care of one another in nuclear fallout, and to learn from the highest ranking government officials that this is actually a fantasy was shocking to me. I did an interview with Obama's former FEMA director. FEMA, of course, is the agency in the United States that helps out its citizens if we have earthquakes, if we have floods, if we have fires. And I asked Craig Fugate, the former director, could he explain to me about plans for a nuclear war, thinking at the time that I would have this whole narrative in my book that demonstrated what FEMA would do. And he explained to me that FEMA's policy is population protection planning. And he said, Annie, nuclear war is what we call a low probability, high consequence event. And, in the event, he said it's like an asteroid strike. And he said, in the event of nuclear war, there is no such thing as population protection planning because everyone will be dead. That is a direct quote. I had to call him back and say, are we sure you want me to say that on the record? That's the quote. And he said, yes.
Thank you. Well, of course, the dinosaurs didn't have the option to avoid the asteroid that made them extinct. But we actually do have a choice. We can choose to eliminate the existential risk by eliminating the weapons. Now, I turn to ask a question of Edwick. Edwick, you advocate in a country and in a region where no state possesses nuclear weapons and where governments and people face so many other priorities, from small arms to development goals and the climate crisis. How do you make the argument for the urgency of nuclear disarmament and for leadership on these issues from your country? And how do those you speak with respond to those arguments?
Thank you so much, Melissa. First of all, it's very important that we emphasize that there is a very close link between nuclear weapons proliferation and the climate crisis. And everyone in the room is actually also facing the devastating effects of the climate crisis, from floods, the rising sea levels, heat waves, droughts, cyclones. The list is just endless. So when I started my advocacy, it was, like you're saying, it was very difficult to have these discussions, especially particularly at community level, where there was really need to break down the jargon, because most people think that when you're talking about nuclear weapons, you are supposed to be a nuclear engineer, and I come from a humanitarian background. So that was my main purpose, to ensure that I break down that jargon to issues, realistic issues that people can actually relate with. Nuclear weapons production, testing, and waste contribute a lot to environmental destruction, and they are also diverting the resources that we need as Africans for climate action. You realize that the global military expenditures right now are exacerbating climate change. Hence, there is really need to reallocate funds towards renewable energy, towards climate mitigation strategies, and towards climate adaptation. So African countries played a leadership role in nuclear disarmament, taking, for instance, the Pelindaba Treaty, which established Africa as a nuclear-free zone. So, basing on this background, you realize that now African countries need to promote the policies that actually ensure that there is redirection of funds from military industries to ensure that there is climate resilient infrastructure and clean energy projects within the continent. Moreover, it is also important to overemphasize that there is need to educate and to mobilize communities, students, to see that nuclear disarmament is actually a peace and environmental issue, and also building coalitions to actually push towards realizing that disarmament is not only a peace and security issue, but it is a humanitarian issue. So it is basically how you will be crafting the arguments around climate disarmament to ensuring that it actually speaks to the realities that we are facing as the African continent, and also building on the leadership that was built by our forefathers when they actually came up with the Pelindawa Treaty. Thank you.
Thanks, Edwick. And of course, ICAN's research shows that nuclear-armed states are spending $91 billion a year on their arsenals, money which could be spent in much better ways for humanity and the planet. Not to mention the scientific research, brain power that is going into helping to destroy the planet rather than to save it. Okay, now, moving on to Zia, question for you. The US sociobiologist psychologist Edward Wilson once said, "The real problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. How can we assure that our godlike technologies, such as nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, don't destroy humanity and the planet?"
I would disagree with the use of the word "our" in this formulation by E.O. Wilson. Nuclear weapons are not our technology. It's not. So there's a particular way of thinking that collapses the actually existing world into, because we share a common peril, it is not correct to assume that it is ours as a whole to think about how we got into this situation and how to attend to it. So I think we have to deal with a fundamental question of power. Right? That we live in a world of nation states, we live in a world of corporations, we live in a world of other kinds of oppressive hierarchies around gender, identity, and lots of other things. So the notion of the our, that this is our world, our technology, etc., shouldn't confuse us that the actual struggle is about the structures and exercise of power in the world that is actually running through all of these things. So I think the first question would be that the presumptions of how to address this, and comes back to these questions of accountability and responsibility, is that we do need to create countervailing identities that are based upon a sense of a common human community, separate from that of systems of nation states and the privileging of my people versus your people, right? Because these kind of fundamental divisions are part of what it allows power to be accumulated and to be used, and therefore we have to confront that. And so I think this is where the United Nations as an institution had attempted to offer a different path, that the charter begins, we the people, right? Seeking to free humanity from the scourge of war, right? Instead, what we have is a system of states and representatives of states and a Security Council. And so there, to me, is encapsulated a core dilemma that what we've done is institutionalize systems of states, whereas the situation we confront is these consequences of the system of nation states is one that imperils everyone. So I think ultimately the question is not about godlike anything or our anything. The question is, what are we going to try and do to build coalitions of peoples, organizations, and like-minded states who are willing to be part of the struggle? And the TPNW and the Landmines Treaty and lots of other things are part of this larger collective effort to deal with the imbalance and distribution of power in the world system as we see it. And so, God and our is not the right way to think about this. You have to fight the power.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, Zia, about the question of artificial intelligence. Professor Geoffrey Hinton, the winner of the 2024 Nobel Prize for Physics for his work on artificial intelligence, has talked about how scientists don't really understand how the human mind, human consciousness works. And he said similarly, no one, and you mentioned to this, no one really understands how artificial intelligence works either. It's evolving so rapidly, it could soon supersede human intelligence. And artificial intelligence is already capable of deceptive behaviour, such as pretending to be less intelligent than it is so as not to be altered by humans. And he said that combining artificial intelligence with nuclear weapons would be putting what are essentially alien beings in charge of weapons that can destroy humanity. And he said, since we can't stop the development of AI, the only way to eliminate the risk is to eliminate nuclear weapons. What do you have to say about that, Zia?
I think the question about AI and nuclear weapons, that we already are not able to fully grasp all the actually existing risks that are at play in the system as it exists already today. So that has already been reason enough for people for generations to fight against nuclear weapons. And it's not been clear to me why adding AI to this, certainly it is a new factor in all of this, as was the coming of the intercontinental ballistic missile, so these are all things that compound the existing set of problems, and there is no doubt about that. But the underlying question about the existence of nuclear weapons has to do with the fact that even if there wasn't artificial intelligence, even if there wasn't intercontinental ballistic missiles, if nuclear weapons were to be delivered on the back of donkeys, we would still have a problem with the fact that these things are capable of indiscriminate vast destruction. So at one point, you deal with the actual core of the problem, which is the existence of technologies of basically unlimited violence in the hands of states.
Thank you, Zia. Now we're going to open up to questions or comments from the audience. I'd like to reserve the first few questions for affected community members. Can people please introduce themselves, and please ensure that you focus on a question to the panel and avoid making lengthy statements. Thank you. Okay, so can I just... how do we say which person it is? We've got the Japanese parliamentarian. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Shinji Morimoto, parliamentarian from Hiroshima, Japan. 6 Japanese parliamentarians here at the MSP. This panel aims to understand the knowns and unknowns about the damage of nuclear weapons and counter the argument that a limited use of nuclear weapons could be acceptable. I'd like to speak about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the atomic bombing and the challenges remaining even 80 years later. You are probably aware that the power of the atomic bomb even 80 years ago was unimaginable. It is said that within 5 months of the bombing, 1/3 of the population of Hiroshima was killed. Intense heat rays, blasts, and fires caused all buildings within a 2-kilometer radius of the hypercenter to collapse or burn, and more than 90% within 3 kilometers. In addition to the heat and blasts, the most serious damage of the atomic bombs in the effect of radiation. This began with acute damage immediately after the atomic bombings. It continued to affect Hibakusha to this day. It is not proven that there is no impact even on their children and grandchildren, and so no relief for their fears now and in the future. In Japan, national government is now responsible for providing assistance to Hibakusha for health, medicine, and welfare. The annual budget is around 100 billion yen, or around 670 million US dollars. Yet, several issues about support for Hibakusha are still debated in Japan. One is who to define as a Hibakusha. Generally, the line is drawn by the distance from the hypercenter. Also, the causal link between radiation and disease is not clear, and so not recognized as a bomb disease. Therefore, all illnesses of Hibakusha are not covered. There are also second and third generation Hibakusha living with health conditions over here. Some are calling in lawsuits for compensation as victims. Regarding the theory of limited nuclear weapons use, I would also like to point out that not only those within a few kilometers of the hypercenter and recognized as Hibakusha were affected by radiation. Immediately after the most bombings, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were hit by black rain. These large drops of rain were like heavy oil containing mud, dust, and radioactive materials blown up from the ground. In Hiroshima, this black rain fell even more than 30 kilometers from the hypercenter. People hit by it suffered the same symptoms as Hibakusha, but it was only 77 years after the bomb in 2022, when they finally were able to receive the same compensation as Hibakusha. This is one rare example for the huge damage that can be caused by limited use of nuclear weapons. I think today's so-called small or tactical nuclear weapons are as powerful as the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Please share your expert opinion on this question. Nuclear weapons and humanity cannot coexist. Humanity doesn't have the technology to limit the effects of nuclear weapons. This MSP takes place at an important timing. After Nihon Hidankyo's Nobel Peace Prize and in the 80th year since the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were more calls than ever before from both citizens and in the national parliament for the Japanese government to join this very important MSP. The Japanese government considered observer participation until the very last moment. However, they did not join. The parliamentarians here at this time will strengthen our collaboration with citizens and NGOs and our efforts in the Diet for the Japanese government to make the decision to join next time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Arigatou gozaimasu, Mr. Shinji Morimoto, Member of Parliament from Japan. Now, is there anyone on the panel who would like to address Mr. Morimoto's question about humanity and nuclear weapons not being able to coexist? Edwick, would you like to take that one? Or okay. Okay, Nick, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your statement. at the risk of sounding trite, I suppose, nuclear weapons and humanity can coexist until they don't. And we don't know when, if or when that will be. So they can exist, but the idea or the argument that they can coexist indefinitely, that's the fallacy that we're working with here. So they can, but surely not indefinitely. And seeing as we don't know if or when that moment will be, and we'll only know if and when nuclear disaster happens, and if there's human capacity to organise itself to respond to it, then we have to work as hard and continuously as we can in the hope that our luck will continue until we can eliminate the weapons. So yes, it's the question of the permanence of the current predicament that we're in that's so deeply concerning, and the stories that nuclear deterrence advocates tell themselves that this is safe and secure and can last indefinitely.
Yes, yeah.
So thank you. Let me just add one thing. The way that we often talk about nuclear weapons, and we've been doing it here also, is about when they go off. And there is explosion, there is destruction, there is death and environmental ruin. But even when they don't go off, nuclear weapons cause a moral injury to what it is to be human. To live in a world where that kind of violence is at work, as Annie was talking about, that they practice ending the world 3 times a day in the Pentagon. And I'm sure similar exercises are done in other countries with nuclear weapons. So there is an ongoing daily moral toll that is taken by the existence of these things. And not just a moral toll. There is a political toll. And as my colleague here was saying, there is an economic and social and humanitarian toll when all the things that we could do with all of those resources being put to the betterment of people and nature. So it's not just about the day the bomb goes off. It's about every day before and up to when the bomb goes off that these terrible things demand extraordinary sacrifices and impose a terrible price on what it means to be human in the world as it actually is. And so I think we have to think about this not just in terms of, the end of the world, but the slow daily violence of living in a world of nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much. Now going to turn to another affected community representative, Mr. Hinamura Morgan Cross, parliamentarian from Tahiti, French Polynesia. Over to you.
It's okay, it's working. I want to ask if I can speak in French, if it's possible. Merci beaucoup, bonjour à tous.
Thank you. I apologize, first of all, because I think my voice remained in Tahiti. It didn't join me on the plane, but I'll try to do my best to speak my community. I want to thank all the panelists for all your presentations, and I want to thank Nick Ritchie for the term that he used in speaking of nuclear violence. I think sincerely there's a lot of vocabulary that needs to be changed in the way we speak of nuclear weapons. And for example, I denounce often in French Polynesia the use of the term nuclear tests, which for me has a very colonial kind of dimension and seeks to minimize the impact. Just to give you an example, when I was young, before becoming an anti-nuclear militant, I thought that in Polynesia we only had tests. So the image I had was someone in a laboratory doing experiments. Until one day, I learned that we had 193 tests. And then I learned that a test is actually a nuclear explosion, a nuclear bomb. And then among these 193 bombs, one was 150 times more powerful than the one used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, in any case, at least in French, I don't know if it's the same in English, we need to change this term test, maybe nuclear explosions, or to speak of nuclear explosions and not tests, and to speak of violence and not simply speak of consequences and legacy, etc. I think changing the vocabulary will make it possible to raise awareness among people of our fight. And of course, I regret the absence of my country, France, here. I think when you've used nuclear weapons on people, such as on the Japanese, or in Polynesia, or in Kazakhstan, or in other areas where tests have been done, you have to be present here at this discussion. And thank you to all the panelists. I think the notion of nuclear war makes it easier to visualize our fight to eliminate nuclear weapons. I think for an everyday person, perhaps you don't feel concerned. You can go out on the street and you know that there are 12,000 nuclear weapons around the world ready to be detonated. But if you go out in the street, you ask an ordinary person, actually, they won't know this. They won't know this figure, even though we know it. So we have to continue this work. Now, my question has to regarding French Polynesia. And by the way, when France decided to conduct its experiments in my country, we were often told that nuclear deterrence is the greatness of France. Well, the greatness of France is being paid by my population by diseases. I'm the third generation of various diseases in my country. I have, for the past 13 years, I've had leukemia. So, and still haven't been cured from it. That is the consequence of nuclear tests. So, when you speak of wars, of course, I don't necessarily feel concerned. I'm very far from the continents. I'm on a small, beautiful Pacific island. So it feels like we're a refuge, a haven. So my question is, what can we do so that the regions historically impacted by nuclear tests remain at the heart of discussions, even though the debate is often focused on future conflicts rather than these kinds of this kind of damage resulting from testing? Thank you.
Nina, I'll just turn over to Edwick to respond to that question.
Thank you so much for the question. I feel the first thing that we need to do is to ensure that we push for global accountability. There is need that nuclear-armed states take responsibility for the environmental harm that has been caused in the past, particularly in nuclear explosions. And I also thank you for actually explaining that there is need to change the terminology. So we also need to ensure that we call on nuclear power states to ensure that they commit to disarmament as part of their broader obligation to combat all these issues that we are discussing, and also calling for reparations for the past ills that have been done. And also, I think it's also important that we actually frame nuclear disarmament as a humanitarian imperative. And if we do that, I'm very sure that we can all play a leading role in ensuring that we create a safer and more sustainable world, and a world where we do not forget about the past atrocities that have been caused by nuclear explosions. Thank you.
Thanks, Edwick. Nick, did you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. I was once berated by a French general for describing French war plans as plans for massive indiscriminate nuclear violence. The French general did not like that term, violence, and his reaction spoke volumes in terms of the way in which he understood what French nuclear weapons were for. But just to pick up on the wider point that the language we use, as I'm sure we all know, is so important in terms of how it constitutes the systems of meaning by which we make sense of nuclear weapons. We see the systems of meaning by which people in your country and my country and in this country in the United States make sense of nuclear weapons in terms of things that are necessary, legitimate, strategically rational, all those sorts of things. And what we are engaged in is a continuous contestation of that with a different system of meaning in which nuclear weapons are utterly unacceptable. They bear no relation to ideas of security or the ideas of security that we have at that collective level, as Zia says, has no place for genocidal weapons of terror. So yeah, the language that we use is so important, and yeah, I commend you for all your work that you've been doing.
Thanks so much, and I think that is a really good point about language and about the deliberate abstraction that's used by nuclear armed and complicit states to talk about nuclear weapons, to talk about their deterrent, stability, tests and so forth. It's used by those states to hide the true violence behind those policies. And it is important, I think, that we can attempt to reframe many of those terms into terms that explain what they actually mean. So now I will turn to state representatives who have hands up for questions. So firstly, New Zealand, Ambassador Deborah Giles.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you to the panel and to our civil society representatives for these fascinating discussions which really equip us better, I think, to question the underlying assumptions of nuclear deterrence and security and the fallacy of a limited nuclear war. Keeping in mind the point made by Zia about the need to talk to those in power, the nuclear weapon states. I'm interested to hear from the panel their views on whether you think, is there potential and what might that look like to have such discussions in the NPT context? Thanks.
Address that. Zia?
Thank you. Absolutely. I think that the NPT process does offer a forum for having those conversations, as do many other international forums. But in the case of the NPT in particular, I think that the new set of arguments and questions in particular that have been developed as part of the consultation led by Austria on how to understand and articulate the security concerns of the communities and states of the TPNW, two nuclear-armed states and their allies, offers the beginnings of a collective, organized conversation rather than, just individual efforts to open up those conversations. So I think the idea of having a clearly articulated shared perspective on what are the security perspectives and concerns that TPNW states and populations have, and being able to present them collectively at the NPT and other forums offers a new kind of engagement. And I think the onus then is on the TPNW states parties to think about what are the most effective communicators of those questions and where are the most important fora where those questions could be articulated. Because one of the things that we do need to keep in mind, and this follows the observations that have been made earlier in some of the questions, is that because of nuclear weapons having this multidimensional violence that plays out in the world, it doesn't have to be just in these multilateral nuclear processes that we can have these conversations. I think we can have these conversations in as many possible venues as states can manage and as NGOs and others can manage. And so raising the questions about the daily, everyday costs of nuclear weapons in the world in environmental fora, in sustainable development fora. There are as many possible avenues as we can think of, and not just limit it to the question of, you know, the possession and use of nuclear weapons in a treaty kind of setting that we have. But that's absolutely a place to start. But I think one of the things that we can do is to develop this broad perspective on how we think about nuclear weapons rather than the narrow security military perspective that nuclear weapon states would like to silo this conversation into, and to say we will have this conversation with you in all possible venues, in all possible registers, because we think actually nuclear weapons have consequences and effects and manifestations that spiral through all the things that are actually at work for people and states and nature today.
And thank you for that perspective. And indeed, it is really important that we de-silo this issue, take it out of the. So it's not just in security and disarmament fora, but it is talked about in connection with the environment, with human rights, with health, with food security. That because everything will be affected by a nuclear war. Now, I know, Annie, you would like to respond as well.
Thank you. I have a thought on that and also on the previous question from him. It took me a minute to think about this, but, you know, we're talking about language and we're talking about thinking and how we express ourselves and and we're talking about a problem and a solution. And I often think about the phrase, you can't fix what you can't face, but you can fix what you are willing to face. And so siloed thinking, very much like euphemism, is very much part of the problem because it keeps people from, you know, really dealing with the real facts of the matter. But one of the things I do is I interview people in the Pentagon, in the CIA, in that world, to try and understand that perspective as well. And you know, see people for their own humanity. And many of my sources are retired. And so that plays an important point because they become humans again, in essence. And I think one of the problems with military thinking is that it's a system of thinking. And so you can get, you know, into it. But Hinamura's question was so interesting to me because it reminded me, I interviewed many of the Manhattan Project engineers who then went on to work for the Atomic Energy Commission, who actually armed, wired, and fired the thermonuclear weapons that did so much harm. And these were engineers. And one of them asked me a sort of strangely, you know, question from the other side of the mirror that Hinamura just asked, which was, he said, it doesn't make any sense to me why the Atomic Energy Commission and the Defense Department call our thermonuclear tests a shot. So in other words, they say, we have a shot today. And he had fought in World War II, and he explained to me what a single shot meant to him from a bullet from someone he had killed in war. And he couldn't understand how the most powerful weapon in the world would be called the same thing as a single bullet. Euphemism.
Thank you. Okay, now we'll take a question from Malaysia. Mr. Shivanan Siva. Where are you?
Thank you, Mr. President and Madam Moderator. We've certainly had a very rich and thought-provoking discussion on the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons. Our panelists have noted how our collective security is precariously reliant on the judicious decision-making of those states that choose to rely on nuclear weapons in their doctrines and policies. They've also highlighted the fallacy of the notion of a limited nuclear conflict, given the far-reaching impact on all states that would result from any use of a nuclear weapon. This appears particularly relevant to states parties' ongoing efforts to universalize the TPNW. And in this connection, the work stream led by Austria on articulating the security concerns of TPNW states parties is also something that comes to mind. I have a fairly broad question, taking into account the comments of Ms. Edwick Madzimure. Apologies if I mispronounced your name, but the question relates to what states parties can do in terms of better socializing this collective knowledge and understanding, including the discussions that we've had through the TPNW framework, with a view to increasing momentum in our efforts to achieve a nuclear weapon-free world. And in this respect, if within our national systems, for example, there are particular groups of stakeholders that would be useful for us to engage with. I recall from yesterday's discussion, we touched on bar councils, given the legal dimension of this debate, and maybe scientific organizations or other bodies if we can have the perspectives of our panelists on this issue. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Edwick?
Thank you so much for that, and I also appreciate that you are taking into cognizance steps that will get out of this room to ensure that we keep the momentum. First of all, I feel it's very, very important that we raise awareness on these issues, because one thing that I have realized that there's a lot of knowledge gaps when it comes to the nuclear disarmament issues, not only on the public, but even on members of parliaments that are supposed to be making laws. They need to be educated. I remember at some point I was doing a research and I had a chat with one of the politicians. And I even asked him, why is it that you do not speak publicly about these issues? He was very open to me. He said, you guys, you're supposed to come to the parliament. You're supposed to educate us because some of these things we don't know. And he was even referring to the war that was fought in Zimbabwe long back. And he was saying those are the weapons that we are aware of. These modern weapons, we are not aware. So it's very important that we take priority in ensuring that we educate not just the public, but your fellow members of parliament that are responsible for making laws, and also ensuring that you make policies that actually also support universalization at local level. And then you were also asking about who are you supposed to also rope in. There's lack of research, particularly when it comes to our region, research that speaks to our own realities, especially as African countries. So it's important for us also to give them resources so that they'll be able to conduct researches, so that we document these issues, so that we ensure that we are not only educating this generation, but it's also important for the future generation, and to ensure that there are people that are going to carry this forward, even if we fail. But we know that we've got young ones that are going to carry this forward, and the momentum will not die. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'd like to, as you mentioned the role of parliamentarians there, Edwick, and I'd just like to give a shout out to the parliamentarians who are here at this 3MSP. I think there's around 27 parliamentarians from 17 countries, which is fantastic. And they are taking the initiative to educate themselves and then to go back to their national parliaments and talk about these issues. Zia?
Thank you for the question about socializing knowledge about nuclear weapons. So I think that we have some important opportunities because of the General Assembly resolution creating the new UN Scientific Panel on the Effects of Nuclear War. One thing that states parties may wish to consider as part of this socializing the knowledge of nuclear weapons is that foreign ministries should be in touch with their national science academies on this question directly and say that there is this UN panel, we voted for this study, and we would like the National Science Academy to reach out to our scientific sector in our universities and research institutions and think about how it can prepare material that can feed into this scientific panel, so that the perspective of an analysis of how nuclear war might affect Malaysia or East Asia or Africa comes from the ground up to the panel, rather than the panel having to look down at all the areas of the world in a limited amount of time. It's not possible to do all of this. So I think I would urge all states parties to think about what is it that diplomats in the TPNW process and the national focal points can actually do to speak to their science academies and say, this is an opportunity for the Science Academy to work with the government to feed information and perspective directly into this. So have a seminar between the Foreign Ministry and the Science Academy. This is the TPNW. This is what the issues are. These are the skill sets that we need. Can you develop a working paper, a memo, a short report that can be sent to the scientific panel for them to include in their discussions? And by the production of knowledge, you begin to socialize that kind of knowledge and create the networks of scientists and diplomats that can work together taking this process forward. And the other thing that I would urge in terms of this process of socializing knowledge is that one of the things that is very important is that ministries of education are not typically part of our conversations, right? I mean, even yesterday we talked about law, we talked about science, we talked about militaries, etc. But thinking about how to actually work with ministries of education and think about how to not just introduce the perspectives of the TPNW, but the whole humanitarian perspective into the education system so that the next generation of young scientists, young lawyers, young teachers, young doctors are socialized into this knowledge and perspective throughout their educational experience, and it becomes part of how they think about their role as a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer, etc., and can always be part of bringing that perspective into the work that they do. And so I think that contributes to the broader set of shared concerns that many of the states have, because the states parties of the TPNW are also, the leaders of humanitarian disarmament in all of its aspects. So I think thinking about how to embed that with the nuclear weapons as well as other perspectives into educational systems is one thing that can go from foreign ministries and begin the process. So reach out to, that would be my advice. I just make more work for you.
I think that's, excellent advice. Nick, over to you.
Yeah, just in terms of the response to the question of how do we engage people who don't know much but have agency, if they knew more might want to exercise it in your political systems, I think there are a number of things, a number of starting points. One is that we know the risks are significant based on the empirical knowledge that we have, so educating people about that. Being clear that nuclear deterrence has always been contested, that those forms of contestation are growing in all sorts of ways, and that's despite the asymmetries of power we're dealing with here in terms of the nuclear-armed states and their supporters versus, say, the TPNW states parties, and that change is possible. We know that. We've experienced it in lots of different ways in nuclear politics and more broadly, and that there are concrete processes for working towards change. And I think in terms of the universalization point, I would say, if it's not too politically unpalatable, that taking a decision not to support this treaty is as important a political intervention in these processes as taking a decision to support it. It's not ambivalent. It's not sitting on the sidelines. States parties, particularly those that are members of nuclear weapons-free zones, that have not taken the decision to sign and ratify this treaty, are making a political statement by doing so, whether they accept that that's what they are doing or not. So I think, engaging other states on that basis, I think is something we can definitely do.
Great, thank you. Now I take a question from Austria, Mr. George Wilhelm Gallhofer.
Thank you very much. Fantastic panels. We're really grateful. We're continuing this very good tradition, and I wonder whether discussions in other fora might well be a bit more productive if we had such a fantastic and inspirational kickoff. So thank you for these excellent presentations and also for the answers that already were given to the question of what can we do, as asked by Zia and Nick. And if I may add, it appears to me that we have many hooks at the moment, actually, with the new UNGA resolution you mentioned, Zia, on nuclear war research, but also with current tensions showing the fragility of the theory of nuclear deterrence more widely. And with your book, Ms. Jacobsen, soon to be a film, we may well have another day after rallying point, a point with which our treaty, the TPNW, may be different to then, with the TPNW as a tool for publics to engage and understand the agency of reacting against this constant threat of nuclear violence that they have not consented to. A question that occurred to me during the panel is that it is striking of how much of what we know publicly about the risks and consequences of nuclear weapons stems from the United States. And to what extent can we really interpolate the same evaluations and risk readiness for the other nuclear-armed states, also given Sia's very pertinent point of the fundamentally different assessments, even of the same set of information? Thank you.
Great. Now, would you like to respond to that, Annie?
The work that we do, or the work I do, is always on the shoulders of other people's work. And so all of these studies are important. But you are absolutely right that the Freedom of Information Act that we have here in the United States allows for people like me and others to understand deeply the weapons themselves, the weapon systems, and the other countries don't have that same transparency by any stretch. You know, one of the things that I worked with, a document to demonstrate to readers in appalling detail the humanitarian effects of a nuclear war, exactly what happens to people, to places, to things. I used a document that was never even declassified. It's called Army Manual 52. It's also called The Effects of Nuclear Weapons. It's a Defense Department thick tome of about 800 pages that began, gathering statistics. And it began with the effects in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you had scientists measuring. My copy of that book has in the back a slide rule, a wheel-shaped slide rule that you can, at this distance, your face will burn off. And I'm not kidding. This is the kind of language that's used in this document. And it is there. It should be read, and hoping for transparency from other countries is aspirational, but it's important because I think it leads to action.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other panelists want to jump in?
So, thank you for that question. We can see from the current nuclear postures of the different nuclear-armed states and their allies that there are differences in perspective about how to think about risk and nuclear weapons. So it's fairly well understood that, as was mentioned yesterday also, that the US has a policy of keeping some of its nuclear weapons on high alert, with the option to be ready to launch on the warning of an attack. And some people have explained that this is one consequence of the lasting impact of Pearl Harbor, and the fear of devastating surprise attack that took place then. The same generation that went through that was the generation that presided over the coming of nuclear weapons into the military structure. And so the surprise military attack became a defining thing. So not all states have that military cultural moment, and so they don't all think about it in terms of having everything ready to launch at a minute's notice. And so it's well understood that, for example, many of the nuclear weapons in the Chinese arsenal presently are actually in storage and not ready to be deployed for launch at a moment's notice. And they're willing to accept a first strike and then think about how to retaliate afterwards. So there are different perspectives, but the perspectives don't stay fixed over time. So we also see that. So it's not that there's an enduring fixed perspective in all of this. But I think that this is why there are, I think, in-between processes that one can attend to. So I think that TPNW states, for example, should offer to have a serious dialogue with China and others about, you have proposed a treaty of no first use of nuclear weapons, including no use against countries in nuclear weapon-free zones and non-weapon states and so on. Tell us how you would intend to operationalize that. What does that actually mean for us? Right? How would it make any difference? And then begin a dialogue with the other nuclear weapon states that, this is something that is explained to us as a way to reduce the risk of certain kinds of nuclear possibilities. So why not? Let's have a conversation about this. So this is not about settling for that, but to begin to ask the question that how does your posture and your arsenal reflect your risk analysis, and how does your choices impact our security judgments, which is part of the kinds of sets of questions that Austria has been developing. But I think one can concretize that into specific questions to ask specific states addressing their specific current military postures and say, okay, given your postures as we understand them, what about this?
Thank you. Now I have a question from Ireland, Mr. Jason Robinson.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and I'd like to thank the panelists for their really excellent presentations on this important issue. As my delegation underscored in our intervention during the first panel, the consideration of the cost of nuclear war and its impacts is a key driver for this community's motivation to negotiate, adopt, and advance the TPNW. At a time of elevated risk of nuclear conflict, there's a clear need for an up-to-date, objective, and publicly accessible understanding of the impacts of nuclear war, and we very much welcome this morning's panel session, which speaks to that pressing need. 9 states now possess nuclear weapons, and nuclear threats are multipolar and transcontinental. We need a more sophisticated grasp of the scale and nature of these new risks in a world with over 8 billion people facing grave climatic pressures, interconnected processes, and increasing instability. In this light, Ireland was proud, in partnership with New Zealand, to propose the convening by the UN Secretary-General of a new scientific panel of 21 experts to examine the effects of a nuclear war. The call for applications to this panel is ongoing, and we look forward to the panel's establishment and supporting its work. Current research already points clearly towards one broad outcome of a nuclear detonation, as this morning's presentations have reaffirmed in stark detail. The consequences would be catastrophic. Irrespective of the cause, it would include mass deaths, destruction and displacement, as well as profound and long-term damage to human health, the environment, climate, and socio-economic development. The scope, scale, and interrelationship of the humanitarian consequences caused by nuclear detonation are truly devastating and more complex than commonly understood. Such use would transcend national borders. The use of any nuclear weapon, irrespective of cause, size, or intent, would threaten the very survival of humanity. Any suggestion to the contrary is both dangerous and illusory. We welcome today's presentations, which have reaffirmed this inescapable reality. We know that we have only touched the surface of our understanding and knowledge of these effects, including with regards to marginalised populations, and exploring further our research agenda regarding the disproportionate impacts on women and girls. Ireland remains committed to working with all stakeholders to ensure that the true cost of nuclear weapons and their humanitarian consequences are known. As we have stated many times, nuclear weapons offer no safety or security. They continue to threaten the very existence of humanity, spanning generations in their potential impact. Therefore, we must all work together to eliminate these weapons once and for all. And before finishing, we'd like to pose 2 questions, which I think perhaps the panel have answered in small part, but maybe there might be some nuance to it. One is to Annie Jacobsen, and I think one thing that motivated the rationale for ourselves in New Zealand proposing that UNGA resolution was our sense that the degree of public awareness of nuclear risk, particularly amongst younger generations, is not what it once was, and there was survey material and other evidence to that fact. And I think the popularity of your book, which is very welcome to see, speaks to a real public appetite and engagement around these issues, and one that policymakers should look to utilise, and we will try to utilise. And I was wondering, just from your broad perspective, what you found the most compelling element that readers are anchoring to in terms of that engagement and that popularity with the text. And a question to Zia in a similar vein, and I think you've answered in small part, but is what do you see as the barriers or opportunities to better public understanding of these complex scientific assessments and information? I suppose it's the flip side of maybe the Annie question in terms of how do we make it digestible and understandable, and then also I think it's something that's spoken to what many of you have intervened on, which is actual meaningful policy engagement and development around these issues. Thanks again.
Thanks very much. Annie?
Thank you for that. I think that readers have been shocked by actually what I was shocked as well, learning and writing and reporting the book, about the speed of action with which a nuclear war unfolds. That an ICBM cannot be redirected or recalled, that it takes approximately 30 minutes from a launch pad across the world to come to the United States. People were horrified to learn, true fact, we have what is called sole presidential authority. It is exactly like it sounds. And then finally, this idea of that launch on warning protocol, that the U.S. does not wait to absorb a nuclear blow. So we launch if we're attacked.
Thank you. Zia?
Thank you, Jason. So in terms of barriers and opportunities to public understanding and action, three things come to mind. One is that there is a well-established phenomena that there are things that people prefer not to know too well because they think there's nothing I can do about it, and this knowledge will only be debilitating. If I know how terrible nuclear war is, to the point where it becomes vivid, but there's nothing I can do, then it just haunts me. So then it's better to just put that knowledge to one side and actually avoid knowing more, because it reinforces your sense of powerlessness and vulnerability. So I think thinking about that knowledge has to come with a story and an opportunity for agency is one thing. And the second part of that, I think, is that there is a well-established problem of deference, that both states and experts like the public to defer to them. We will look after you, trust us. You don't have to worry yourself about these matters. It's in good hands, right? And so policymakers like to do this. Don't ask too many questions. Don't get too involved. We'll take care of it. It's a demobilizing it's an anti-democratic move in a fundamental way. But people have been socialized into this on lots of issues. And so thinking about how to connect skepticism about expertise and skepticism about authority itself is a necessary part of this. You know, convince me, don't tell me that it's in good hands. Show me how it is in good hands. Show me what you are doing. And here I think a key thing would be that I think many populations, including in TPNW states, would be more involved if they knew and could see how active their governments were on these issues. So I think having TPNW diplomats be actually seen to be publicly visible figures doing this kind of work would actually encourage more people to be more interested and more involved and do more. And the last thing that I would say is that I think you're right that there is a generational gap here, but the generational gap plays in both directions. Young people, by and large, in all the surveys that have been done, tend to be much more sensitive to humanitarian concerns and justice concerns because they didn't grow up in the Cold War period in large parts of the world. And so the issue there is because they didn't grow up in the Cold War world, there's no reason for them to have been that involved in thinking about nuclear weapons. But they start from a different perspective on how to think about the question. So I think what we have to do is to figure out a way of talking to them that begins from that sensibility that they have, rather than begin from the sensibility that would have had more traction with people who grew up thinking about, nuclear Cold War stability and balances and so on. So, and I think there the fundamental question does become how to turn this sense about humanitarianism into an argument about justice. Because if there is one thing that actually you can see across the world, it is the language of justice, whether it's climate or race or gender or anything. Fundamental arguments in the next generation are couched in the language of justice. And we need to think about how to connect our work to the work of justice movements.
Thank you for those inspiring words. Now, we've got not that long left to go in this session, so I'm going to ask that questions from the floor be and responses from panellists be kept to a minimum as much as possible. So I'm going to turn now to Mexico, Mr. Braulio Fasto.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. We're grateful to the chair for organizing this panel, and of course grateful to the panelists for the information they've shared. There's no doubt that Mexico agrees with the importance of not forgetting in our discussions the humanitarian consequences that a nuclear detonation would have on Earth, not only for humankind, but for the environment and for life in general. And of course the cascading effect from this. Bearing this in mind, we'd like to ask if you have any comments on the consequences of a nuclear conflict or detonation in outer space, and the way in which you think the TPNW complements other international instruments regarding nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just turn to Annie and then perhaps to Zia.
So, spoiler alert, in my book I discuss this. There is a very unfortunate fact that most people do not know and used to be hotly debated in the United States, but I think Richard Garwin settled the debate for all of us, unfortunately, in my book, which is that an EMP, if it were to be detonated 300, in space, so 300 miles above Omaha, would essentially ruin the power grid of the entire United States. So space is a very dangerous place for nuclear weapons. There have been threats both from Mr. Putin. It is believed that North Korea has the capacity to loft a small nuclear weapon into space disguised as a satellite, a reconnaissance satellite. This is a very big problem. I'm glad you brought it up. We might have to sidebar a conversation about this. Thank you.
Just to clarify, the EMP is an electromagnetic pulse, and it's scary reading.
It's the result of an EMP. For those who are wondering, is the result of a nuclear explosion. It's a pulse of electromagnetism. Thank you
for that. Now we'll go back to some civil society representatives. We have. Oh, sorry, Zia. Did you want to add?
No, thank you for that question. Before I try and answer it, I want to prefigure it with one observation, and that is that the reason we become concerned about the possibility of nuclear weapon explosions in space, is because of the increasing militarization of space and the reliance of nuclear-armed states on space-based assets for their nuclear arsenals and capabilities and their larger military capabilities. And so even though it was agreed a long time ago not to station nuclear weapons in space, because of the increasing militarization of space, it becomes part of military planning then to think about how to address exactly that question. And therefore the use of nuclear weapons to disable your adversary's military capabilities in space, as you would also want to disable them on the ground, becomes necessarily a part of military planning if you have nuclear weapons in the first place. So I think the correct place to begin this conversation is to actually ask, how are we having a conversation about the need to demilitarize space? Because as long as space is the place where there are increasingly important military capabilities, then you're going to inevitably see space as a battleground. And the fact that the United States, for example, has a space command whose job it is to prepare to fight war in space, and with nuclear weapons, then you think about how to fight nuclear war in space also. So I think the conversation to be had doesn't necessarily begin with the use of nuclear weapons in space, but the question of the need to have an agenda for the demilitarization of space. And as part of that, begin to ask the question that if you detonate a nuclear weapon in space, it does not destroy just the military assets and capabilities of your adversary, but in the same way as on the ground. As we know, famously, the United States argued that it dropped the atomic bomb on a military base in Hiroshima and just destroyed the entire city. So saying I'm going to use a nuclear weapon to destroy my adversary's space-based nuclear satellite, but you're going to destroy lots of other things that are part of the larger system of capabilities that serve many other purposes. So that would be the way, I think, to begin to ask the question properly.
Thank you, Zia. Now, a question from Ms. Yukino Yamaguchi from No Nukes Tokyo, please.
Thank you very much. I am Yukino Yamaguchi, the third generation of hibakusha from Nagasaki. I am very honored to be here as a delegate from Japanese civil society youth advocacy group No Nukes Tokyo. As a bomb survivor Jiro Hamasumi said, I was considered as an hibakusha even before I was born. In yesterday's A-bomb testimony session, we descendants in the third generation of hibakusha already started our lives as the blood relatives of A-bomb survivors at the time of our birth. From that point on, we have lived our lives while confronting, concerning, and thinking about the history of the atomic bombings. I sometimes feel that we descendants in the third generation of hibakusha too may be sufferers of the tragic consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. Touching upon the discussions, the argument of to what extent limited use of nuclear weapon would be accepted has been heard even in youth community in recent years. However, I would like to emphasize and share with other youth that there are not even the slightest benefits of any limited use of nuclear weapons in the world. As in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, regardless of the size and numbers of the nuclear weapons, even if they were used once in a city with a small population, the casualty and its effects would rapidly spread beyond the city and even generation. Thank you already for your comments about the young generation. I have one more question. If nuclear weapons are used in a limited use scenario, is there a possibility that as the damage would increase, the discussion of environmental restorations and concrete efforts to provide assistance to the victims could be trivialized? There is also a concern that issues of nuclear weapon itself may decline, so we would like to ask from this perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Edwick, would you like to take this question about environmental consequences and issues of intergenerational justice?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think it also goes back to the discussion that we were having earlier on, to say that in all the discussions that we are going to have going forward, it's very important that we talk about the issue of justice, and we also talk about the issue of reparations. And just like what Zai has been talking about, to say that it also lies with us, the young generation, to ensure that we keep the discussion going and we ensure that history is not forgotten. And while we are ensuring that history is not forgotten, we also keep on emphasizing to say that we don't want the same issues to be repeated again in the future. So basically, I think as young people, that is what we are supposed to be doing, to ensure that what happened in the past will never happen again. And as much as we are doing that, we also call for justice for the communities that were affected. And I would also want to reiterate that these testimonies that we are hearing in this room actually shows that, like you said, there are no benefits for any nuclear detonation. So that's something that we should keep emphasizing on.
I'll turn over to Nick now. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah. I just want to, I guess, note that much of the conversation in the room, as the Austrian delegation suggested, has revolved around the United States, nuclear-armed states, and imagined scenarios of nuclear violence, including imagining scenarios of limited nuclear war and what that might mean and so on. And that's important, but I guess I just wanted to shift our focus back to the question that's more relevant to this community of states and civil society organisations, which is how we respond to this, how we respond to this shared risk of nuclear violence, and how we do that through this collective process of inventing nuclear disarmament. This complex system of nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapon systems has been built by people, right, over 80 years or so, and it can be taken apart. And yes, we can understand the challenges of doing so and what we're up against, and it's important that we do the work and share that knowledge to understand what it is we are engaging with. But catastrophizing is one thing, and like I say, it's important to do that and think through and understand as best we can what might happen. But that can detract us from what I think we are here to do and what the TPNW is part of a longer process in, which is inventing those shared processes, or through shared processes of developing ideas, translating them into practices, into technologies, into institutions, into treaties, into laws, into norms. And we can only do that together, and we don't know what will work until it happens and we can look back and kind of trace what worked. So we need to try lots of different things. But that needs to be the central focus in my perspective. That needs to be the central focus. And yes, thinking clearly about the risks that we face should inform that. We shouldn't just stop with the risks that we face. Coming back to the question from Ireland about engaging younger people with this. I and many others in the room teach young people about these issues, and there's deep concern and engagement. And one can get to the point of why should we care, and students, young people, quickly grasp why they should care. The next question is, what can I do? And that needs to be front and centre. What can we do? And on the basis of the report or the panel that New Zealand and Ireland are sponsoring, that's going to generate really vital new knowledge. But on the back of that, then, this community must be asking that question, what can we do with this? How can we engage people with it in this collective process of inventing nuclear disarmament?
Just very quickly from me, I'd like to say, please keep doing what you're doing. First-hand experience is the most powerful.
Right, now we have a contribution, you see, oh goodness, from, back to, I've lost my, Dr. Ivana Hughes, please, who's a member of the Scientific Advisory Group.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you all for this really deeply insightful discussion. I'm truly grateful for the many threads that have come up in this rich conversation. I have two very brief comments and one brief question. My my first comment is about the conversation about probability, and I say this having had multiple conversations with Marty Hellman about his own estimates of probability. He actually stresses that he made those estimates before 2022, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I just wanted to put that out there, and he perhaps unsurprisingly thinks that the probability is surely much higher today. The second comment I wanted to make is about the notion of nuclear deterrence. We heard from Zia a little bit about some of the conversations. Actually, some of Einstein quotes came up as well. Some of the conversations that scientists were having about nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence was not one of those conversations. Nuclear deterrence, and I apologize to all the economists in the room, but it was the economists who gave us nuclear deterrence, Thomas Schelling, et cetera. So, scientists were seeing these weapons as the danger that we see them as very early on. And so this notion that they keep us safe really came later. The last thing I have is a question for Annie, and I just really want to highlight how thrilled I am that she's here with all of us, and what a gift her book has been to the disarmament movement. Annie, I wanted to ask you about your conversations with people. You mentioned some of them are retired, so perhaps that's why they're talking to you. But whether retired or not, the people who are practicing this 3 times a day, the people who really, truly understand what's at stake, what do they say to you at the very end? I mean, do they say do they quote JFK, we must abolish nuclear weapons before they abolish us? Thank you so much. Thank you all again.
Thank you for that question. I interview retired people in nuclear command and control because it's just so much easier to get a straight answer. If you're going to interview I also do interview current officials, but you have to go through public affairs, which is has several other names. So you really want to get the truth from someone who has had the long lens of experience, at least in my opinion. And that brings us to that you get people sort of in the latter stage of their life. And I believe that, yes, wisdom comes with age. And so there is the opportunity for reflection and the opportunity for an individual in these positions of extreme former power of nuclear command and control to say, perhaps I might have something to say to the younger generation. And I think that speaks volumes, and I'm very grateful to be the one who passes that information on to the public.
Right. Now we'll just move on to a question from Actually, we've got a question from El Salvador. Julia Rodriguez Acosta. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias a los panelistas por la...
Thank you very much to the panelists for their valuable contributions. Regarding the discussion on the integration of general use technologies such as artificial intelligence into nuclear weapons, I'd like to ask the following. How can we strengthen the need that systems of control, communication, and command over nuclear technology remain under human supervision and decision, and avoiding that critical decisions be delegated to automated systems or based on AI systems? Furthermore, even though we recognize that the only guarantee against the use of nuclear weapons is their total elimination, how can we ensure that in the process towards disarmament, the human control continues to be meaningful and is not eroded by the use of these technologies? Thank you.
Who would like to just... Zia, did you want to just...
Thank you for that question. First, one observation. When you think about the existing systems of nuclear command and control, decision-making, implementation, one thing that's very important is that in all the nuclear-armed states, as far as we know, the people in charge are trained to operate as if they were machines. You obey the order, you do exactly what A, B, C, D. So they have lists. If this, then this. If this, then this. If this, then this. So because the point is to remove error from the process and to remove the human agency so that a soldier doesn't decide, oh, I don't want to do this. So the existing systems turn people into machines to make sure that the orders will be obeyed the way that they are done. So this has been a constant dilemma for militaries, as far as we know. And so when you talk about them becoming replaced by AI systems, the change may not be as great as you think. The element that you have to think about here is that the speed will increase, and we don't know necessarily, as the question was things, the AI systems well enough to always anticipate how they will respond. So they may be actually less machine-like than the people, because they will make different kinds of errors that we didn't anticipate. So the problems do grow worse. But the last thing I would say is that what we really need to think about is actually not the mechanics of the in-between, because the issue is the decision that is made first about using nuclear weapons. And so it's a very complicated set of issues, and we are starting to grapple with the replacement of old systems for managing these kinds of capabilities with new systems. And with any new system, there is a learning period where you learn how the system will actually work in the world, not the way you thought it would work in the world. And there will be problems, there will be errors, there will be things that we did not think of in advance. So be prepared for a lot of things to go wrong.
Thank you. We now have a question from Mr. Gordon Glass in the second row of the gallery. Thank you.
Microphone. Thank you very much to the panel, and I particularly want to give my thanks to Annie Jacobsen for her amazing and very timely book. But I have my role is to ask questions which are seemingly impossible to answer, and so it's a simplistic question which I'll direct to Zia, but it's really to the whole room, including the Secretariat. Is there are the 9 men in the world are the ultimate decision, the only decision makers when it comes to launching nuclear weapons. What can this organization do, or this conference do, to encourage them to get together to meet about the principles of that decision making? And maybe what can this conference make recommendations or suggestions to the UN General Assembly or to the Secretary General to set up a meeting which might be disguised as a training program or an inquiry program about this level of decision making and how it works and what lessons can be learned from it. And we're helped by the fact that I'm told that in Newsweek recently that the US President is very keen to talk to Russia about nuclear weapons and start this discussion going. So I think the door is open. What can this conference do? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think it was directed to Zia. Does anyone else want to?
So I would happily defer this question to Ambassador Clement.
To Annie and then to Nick.
I have a quick and hopeful thought on that, twofold. First of all, the advancement of the TPNW is incredible, and that is happening and will continue to happen. The other thought is that diplomacy, I believe, does work. And when I think of Reagan and Gorbachev taking the world from 70,000 nuclear weapons in 1986, 70,000. And because of their work together, I believe that is, and others, of course, that is why we now are at 12,300. And so turning the enemy into an adversary that you can work with is the step in the right direction, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks. Nick?
Yeah, just to add to that, there is the P5 process, which is something that can be ridiculed to a certain extent by members of the disarmament community, but knowing from the UK side how much effort had to be put in to make that happen, and then continuing effort to sustain it for what seem like fairly meagre results from the outside. I think we need to be perhaps a bit careful about discrediting that process, because it is the only semi-formal forum process by which at least the permanent members of the UN Security Council meet to discuss at varying levels nuclear weapons issues. But more broadly, I think that we do need to support strategic dialogue between nuclear armed states, because we know historically that that's been really important for developing, or at least creating an opportunity for developing shared understandings around nuclear weapons and nuclear signalling and nuclear war planning and so on. The big danger is that nuclear armed states proceed as if there is a shared understanding when there isn't, and misperception can take hold and escalate in crises. But the challenge, of course, with nuclear deterrence is that, as we found out with Mr. Putin, is that doing nuclear deterrence, when you consider that important things are at stake, incentivizes acting as if there are no shared rules. So one can take this process so far, but ultimately nuclear deterrence as a security ideology needs to be transcended in some way.
Thank you. And we only have time for one more question now. So that's going to be to Mr. Bill Kidd, Scottish parliamentarian, to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, and thank you to everyone on the panel. It's been absolutely superb to listen to serious and constructive argument and debate. Just bringing a message of support from the Scottish First Minister also for everything that's happening here today. But I know we haven't got much time left, so I'm going to ask, if possible, because Scotland holds all of the UK's nuclear weapons against our wishes, but we do have them sited 30 miles from half of our population. And I think it's extremely important that people are made aware as much as possible. And in Scotland, we are very much against having these nuclear weapons in our country. But how much of a target does that, would the panel say, does that actually make this area of Scotland in particular and the country?
Thank you. Perhaps Nick, would you like to deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, one would imagine, and it would be incredible not to imagine, that Russia has standing nuclear attack plans that will target NATO bases and nuclear bases across Europe and across the United Kingdom. It seems implausible that the Faslane naval base wouldn't be targeted, along with other important military, perhaps industrial and nuclear centres across the UK. I live in North Yorkshire, about 10 miles away from the US National Security Agency base at Menwith Hill. And when it was the first time I really got properly scared about nuclear war, when Russia invaded Ukraine, because I knew that would be a target. My kid's school is about 10 miles downwind of that. So it brings home the reality of what nuclear war could actually mean. And I think the people of Scotland have consistently expressed their deep and abiding concern about being host to a nuclear arsenal that many in Scotland, often the majority, say that they don't want there and don't support.
Thanks very much. I think we'll have to go to closing remarks now. So this discussion has not been just an academic exercise, it is a call to action. The TPNW provides the blueprint for the complete elimination, and it is up to us to support the universalisation and implementation of the TPNW. But it is also up to all of us to fully take on the discourse and policies that stand in our way. As states and civil society, we must all dismantle the pernicious misconception that nuclear weapons have any value in security policies. the mindset that nuclear deterrence is infallible. As former Australian Foreign Minister and co-chair of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, Gareth Evans, said, keeping nuclear stockpiles, even if you don't intend to use them except by way of retaliation, is not a risk-free enterprise. The deterrent utility of nuclear weapons is illusory, and the risk of retaining nuclear weapons far outweighs any conceivable benefit from them. We must reject the notion that any use of nuclear weapons can be limited or managed, and we must reaffirm our collective commitment to the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Author Yuval Noah Harari talks about the power of human imagination to redirect our ingenuity away from self-destruction to self-creation, and that is what this treaty, this community is doing here today. Will you all please join me in thanking our distinguished panellists, Professor Nick Ritchie, Annie Jacobsen, Dr. Edwick Madzimure, and Zia Mian for their invaluable contributions to this issue.
Thank you. I would also like to add my voice and thank the panel for their extremely good presentations, all delegations for the strong engagement in the discussions this morning, and of course you, Melissa, Ms. Parke, for ably moderating this session. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of agenda item 9? I see no objection, and I'm allowed to use the gavel. It is so decided. So before adjourning this meeting, I would like to give the floor to the Secretary General for 2 announcements, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. A couple of announcements. At the request of Kiribati, the Secretariat would like to announce that a side event entitled Advancing Nuclear Justice, a discussion on Articles 6 and 7 and amplifying affected communities will take place from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. in this meeting room, the Trusteeship Council chamber. Please also note that a light lunch in connection with the side event will be served from 1 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. near the Vienna Cafe. In addition, please allow the Secretariat to draw your attention to the exhibitions that are located in GA-1B in the corridor leading to and beside the Vienna Cafe, and those are, in order, 1, Mayors for Peace Atomic Bomb exhibition, 2, Mayors for Peace Children's Art Competition entitled Peaceful Towns, 3, VR Experience, Damages of the Hiroshima Atomic Bombing, 4, Nuclear Tests Impact Map, 5, Echoes of the Polygon, and 6, From the Pacific to the Steppes, Solidarity, Reconciliation, and Nuclear Justice. And finally, the Secretariat would like to kindly remind all delegations to please submit their digital versions of their statements to tpnw@un.org and e-statements@un.org. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I would also like to thank the interpreters for having given us some extra minutes. And this concludes our business for this morning's meeting. We will continue at 3:00 p.m. and begin with the general exchange of views under agenda item 10. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.
Hiya!